If we have a mediocre input, then the output also would be mediocrity. How do we elevate ourselves beyond what the expectation is to achieve excellence?
Welcome to Platinum Conversations in the Platinum Cafe. Today, we wish to engage you on a journey of enlightenment and hopefully growth that will propel you into higher levels of attainment in the thing that's meaningful to you in your life. Let's go.
Hey, let me just make a note that we've introduced a third voice. The Platinum Trio is now present. We've interjected and brought the third Platinum hitter, Mr. Tony Grace, to the table, and he is now part of the Platinum Trio.
Appreciate that, y'all. All right, so we're going to use this opportunity to break into a segment entitled, You Don't Know What You Might Know.
Yes. And, one of the perfect examples that I have in terms of that is one of my gifts is the gift of observation. And so several years ago, I was working at a bakery, and I was a line supervisor at this bakery, but I was noticing gaps in the organizational structure and how employees were being treated at certain levels. And so I took it upon myself to write a proposal to the owners of the company and asked them for a position in human resources. And lo and behold, they gave me the opportunity. And because I asked. Now, mind you, I didn't have any experience in human resources, no exposure to human resources, and no expertise, nor even the education. But what I did once they gave me the opportunity was allow the platinum in me to rise up. And as a result, I called other individuals in other organizations and asked questions in terms of the daily functions of a human resources manager. I shadowed certain individuals, and I started to ask questions about the functions of that role, and I served as their human resources director for 7 years.
Wow, Rob, you're really talking about being platinum and pulling out that platinum that's within you instinctively. And it's funny that you did that with human resources, and that's essentially the same thing that I did. When I moved into human resources from supplemental instruction, I didn't have a background in human resources per se. But what I did have was I had Google and I had YouTube, and I used those, to leverage what I did know and to flip that into the human resources. And just like you did, I called people. I called other human resources managers and said, what is it that makes a successful recruiter? What is it that makes somebody successful in this field? And as they gave me answers, I would write down those answers. And I incorporated that into the messaging that I was giving out to other hiring managers. When I put it in my resume, put it in my cover letter, just to let people know that I've done the research. I've called and I've asked around, and I found out the things that I didn't know, that I knew I didn't know, that I needed to know in order to make me successful. So I guess that's one of the things. You have to know what is it that makes you successful at this thing. And then you have to know, how am I going to go about achieving that success?
I want to pause right there and talk about the last bit you said, the how am I going to go about. What I heard from both of you gentlemen is identifying gaps in your own knowledge. Can we back it up and talk about how the strategy that you use to identify those gaps?
Well, in my experience, because one of the things that I've learned about the journey that I'm on as an individual is that once I establish a pattern, that pattern follows me in every opportunity and every role that I have. And so I've never shied away from going into something that was unfamiliar to me. Because a segue to that is that as a corporate recruiter, when I became a corporate recruiter for the Seattle Times, I went into that organization as a temporary, to do a temporary fill-in for someone who was on maternity leave. And that turned into a full-time opportunity with the organization. And to augment what I'm doing now as a program manager for Pierce College, I started out as a custodian 1. I went to a custodial supervisor, and then a district manager, and then program manager, all within a matter of 18 months. to rise that quickly in an organization that's already has a set structure to it is somewhat unheard of. But I wasn't willing to share with people where I wanted to go, even though I didn't have the expertise, the knowledge, nor the background to get there, because I took the initiative. The initiative fills gaps. And when you find that you're willing to step into that space, the things you need come to you, because everything you're moving towards is also moving towards you.
You want to speak to that?
Wow, Rob, you got to start going second because I can't follow that. But look, I'll tell you what, Tony. The big deal that I came across was observation, and I get, like you said, Rob, one of your gifts. You mentioned your gifts, and one of the gifts I think I have is the gift of emulation, right? And so I observed people that were doing things that I wanted to do, and then I attempted to emulate that, and I noticed in my own results the difference in the results that I had and the results that I wanted. That's how I identified the gaps, was just by observing people that were already doing the thing that I wanted to do, and then trying to do it, and then seeing where I fell short, and not being afraid to fail, just kind of going out and saying, okay, I'm going to try it. I'm going to give it my best shot. I'm going to try it. I'm probably going to fail, and that's good. And when I do, I'm going to learn the new thing that I'm going to learn what I need to learn.
So to summarize what I've heard, and you guys can fill in, at will, the framework for really getting started and identifying what you know and what you don't know starts with initiative, and then identifying those who do it well, and then emulation.
Sure. And if I could, and it's not to challenge something you said, but to add a different layer or different perspective to it in terms of the messaging. One of the most important messages I believe that we send to ourselves is through the ways that we talk about the things that we've experienced. And you talked in terms of the things that I failed at, or what you perceived as those failures. Failure is a perception, but it also has a negative connotation to it that weighs on our mind, that limits how we see ourselves. And so I want to challenge every listener to use different vocabulary to determine or to distinguish what their lived experiences have been. Because when we find ourselves being mindful, and one of the things I learned from you, Dietrich, is this whole idea of mindfulness, and that really talks about communications, self-communication. And so the words you use to describe your experiences impact how you move towards your next experience. And so when we start to change the messaging, because our self-talk is important, and when we learn about the conversations we're having with ourselves, we'll see that we're encouraged to go farther, faster through the messaging.
So how would you reframe that? Instead of saying, I failed at this, how would you reframe that in a more positive way?
I'm hearing process improvement. So if I were to bumper sticker what was just said, this framework for beginning this platinum concept is initiative fills the gaps.
Yes.
Emulation refines the process. Reflection is then the protocol for process improvement.
Yes. Very well said.
Okay.
That's a big bumper sticker.
That is a long bumper.
I want to take a moment to give a special shout out to our Patreons who sponsored this episode of the Platinum Hitters podcast. If you like what we're doing and you want to hear more content, here's how you can become involved. Follow the link in the description box below. For as little as $5 a month, you can get a bonus episode of the Platinum Hitter podcast, access to exclusive content, discounts on merchandise, and you can be among the first to purchase tickets to live seminars and workshops. That's www.patreon.com/Platinum Hitter. Thank you, guys. So I want to circle back to what you said about mediocrity in, mediocrity out, right? It's true for people. So if it's true for one person, it's true for groups of people, like organizations, communities as well. So if mediocrity leaves gaps and initiative fills them, and as Tony so eloquently stated, emulation refines the process and reflection is the protocol for process improvement, then seeing what needs to be done and taking a course of action, initiative,
It takes something good and it makes it great, right? But the opposite must also be true. And so I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago in August is my wife's birthday, and she wanted to go on vacation. I said, okay, where do you want to go? And so we end up deciding that we're just going to drive up to Canada for a couple of days. And so we do, right? But something must have been open in the trash can, because when we got back, there was a line of ants, and my wife hates ants, but it was a line of ants going from the sliding door in the kitchen to the trash can. And from that trash can, they were like exploring the area still, and they went out to the front door, right? So there's a line of ants from the sliding door all the way to the front door. And you know what, Rob? It reminded me of a quote that says, all things trend toward entropy. And entropy just meaning chaos, right? So when you have something that you've built and you don't maintain it or you don't secure it, when you leave gaps, mediocrity leaves gaps, right? So what we should have done is emptied out the trash. And that's just another lesson for life, right? Empty out your trash. But since we didn't do that, we left a gap, right? And so entropy crept in, and the environment starts to take over, and it wants to return itself to its natural state, right? And so my whole point of that is that when you have mediocrity that leaves gaps and initiative that fills it, if initiative doesn't fill the gaps, then something else will. So Rob, can you speak to how the absence of leadership or the absence of taking initiative in the sight of mediocrity leads to mediocre results, or even worse, a trend toward entropy?
Yes. And so I'll use the analogy of the tree being the community. And if the community is toxic and no one wants to live in that community will eventually become abandoned and become ruined. And so the community that is vibrant and full and flourishing is because there are lots of fruit to pick from. There are lots of things kind of contributing to the health of that community. And so that community is a tree that is healthy, but it has roots that is feeding it something that it needs to sustain the life that it provides. And when we become individuals in a healthy community, on a healthy tree, that become toxic, is because we've taken in something that has contaminated who we are in terms of how we think about the community that we're in. And so we began to sabotage that community and tear it down brick by brick, staple by staple. And so sometimes the fruit on the vine can be toxic fruit that's contaminating the other branches and the other leaves and the bark of the tree and eventually the roots of the tree. And so we have various communities in almost every city that you can think of where the cities have come to ruin. Sometimes they are based on our own actions, and sometimes they are based on the actions of others. Basically meaning that there is sometimes jealousies that rise up in us that will cause us to destroy that which is around us because we don't want it to rise up. And a prime example of that is what we call Black Wall Street in Oklahoma. But there are several Black Wall Streets throughout the country that took place where the same thing happened. And so, and to give you a framework for what Black Wall Street meant to people of color, especially African Americans in this country, is that we had thriving communities where we had our own doctors, our own theaters, our own banks, our own infrastructure for building and maintaining wealth. And when persons outside of our community saw the ways in which we were building and how it was sustaining itself, jealousy came in, and then they began to come in and destroy and kill hundreds of people in a single night or over a series of weeks to destroy and dismantle the life and the vibrancy that was taking place. And another example is during the time of emancipation in terms of in the 1800s. That was a time called what we call in historical terms called the Mystic Years. And there were more persons of color of African descent in Congress, there were mayors, there were governors that were in positions of political power than at any point in the history of the United States. But because of redlining, redistricting, and redoing all of these things that kind of gave you a voice in a political sense, they began again to dismantle and destroy it and became poison pills to those communities and dismantle them.
It seems like, they wanted to isolate those communities in order to break them down faster or break them down easier. And that's just like what we were talking about with the whole fatigue idea and withdrawing yourself from the community. Because even if you are a fruit, so to speak, that has spoiled on the vine, you can still serve a purpose. You still have valuable insights as to the health of the community, as to the health of the tree and what's going on, what spoiled you, essentially. And you don't have necessarily the nutrients for other life to be sustained. However, when that spoiled fruit falls to the ground, it can be absorbed back into the roots of the tree, and the tree can then sustain itself based off of that. As long as that fruit doesn't leave the community or act against the community, it doesn't have to tear it down. And as you were talking about trees, it made me think about there's no right or wrong, right? However you identify as a piece of that tree, whether it's the root, the trunk, the branch, the leaf, the fruit, there's no right or wrong position to be in. Each of those positions plays a part, but it's a cycle. It's a cycle. It's a feedback loop, right? And it's a community that's thriving off of each other. And so there's no right or wrong place to identify yourself on that tree. It's just a matter of being in a cycle. And then also cycles are about balance. If you're talking about a bicycle, and I think people have this idea, when you're driving down the road, you don't hold the wheel straight. You have to constantly correct to the left and to the right, back and forth, to stay in your lane. Right? And so when I think about cycles and balance, I think about continually correcting. We're never really going to have it to where it's perfect. There's always going to be jealousy. There's always going to be people from the outside that want to tear us down, right? It's always a matter of how you respond to those changes in the environment. How do you respond to those turns in the road? How do you keep balance with that cycle and maintain the positivity instead of falling off track?
Wow. Excuse me for interrupting, but I find that when we have, and I'm loving the tree analogy, but I think one of the things we sometimes get caught up in is that we are a leaf, but we're not satisfied just being a leaf, so we try to take on the role of the branch. And so we're looking at what the branch is doing and desiring what it be. It's like we began to covet those around us, even though they have a specific function and we have a specific function. We don't stay in our lane. We're looking at what other people are not doing or what they are doing, judging it, making criticisms about it, and again, tearing till sometimes the leaves fall because we pull them down, as opposed to them falling naturally. And so, because I think there are times when we can sometimes do harm to the tree versus building the tree up to be healthy.
Now, Chris Rock had a special on Netflix entitled Tambourine. Tambourine is what he called it. And somebody got to play the tambourine, right? Mm-hmm. Somebody's got to play the tambourine and be proud of playing that tambourine. And I wanted to do two things. I wanted to take the listeners through a thought experiment, and we set that up in a second. But I also wanted to get you guys' opinion on, Robert, what you just brought up about being satisfied in the role that you have, and when and where and strategically, what's the best time to try to maneuver outside of your role without compromising the integrity of the tree, if you will?
Well, there's a natural process to that level to that type of growth. And sometimes it's through what the metaphysicists or osmosis, so to speak. But just taking to an example, an oak tree. An oak tree will pollinate. And when the winds come, the winds will blow that pollen from that tree, the seedlings from that tree, to other parts. And so you may see a tree that springs up a block away, but it's from the tree over here on Elm Street. And so what we find is that sometimes the natural progression of life will take you to the place where you need to be, as opposed to you forcing it or leaving prematurely. So sometimes we have to learn to hold on just long enough until we're taken to the place where we're destined to be.
You also had a quote last time we were speaking about this by Ernest and Julio Gallo, the winemakers,
Yes.
where it said, "We will serve no wine before it's time."
Yes.
right? And that really speaks to being able to measure. And to your point, Tony, like you were saying about when do you know? How do you know when, right? I think that takes self-reflection and self-assessment and being mature enough, right? Well, how do you know? You have to be able to measure. You're measuring your own metrics for success. And how do you know when it's time? Man, the seasons change, right? Look around you. When it's time, it's obvious. Look, trees don't got no clocks, but them leaves all fall at the same time, right? The ants ain't got no clocks, but they know when to store up, right? So we worrying about, when am I gonna get my shot? When am I gonna become this? When am I gonna, in due time, fam? Like in due time, like it's gonna come. You don't really have to worry about that. It's natural.
So let's take them on this thought experiment, and I'd like to set it up, if you would, identify the different roles of this tree, so that the listener knows where to place him or herself, and then kind of explain, how how that impacts the community, how that impacts the tree, and then we'll leave with the thought experiment of who they are with that.
Well, I would kind of frame it in the context of you as an individual tree are also an individual community. And so what you do, how you do it, and the manner in which you do it impacts those that you influence. And so as the roots of this tree go deeper, it penetrates and retrieves nutrients from way deep down. That's called historical knowledge. And so if that tree has roots that are shallow, it may only get this surface knowledge that's just 2 years old. But once that root goes deep, it gets historical knowledge, and it begins to get generational knowledge, and it begins to feed that knowledge to the branches, and the branches began to go out to the leaves, and the leaves began to kind of shape the fruit that comes from that tree. And so there's a scripture that states you will know a tree by its fruit. And so what comes from you is a direct reflection of what and who you are.
Told you I got to start going first, Rob, because you can't. How you supposed to follow Frank Sinatra?
Listen, I wanted to ask y'all. I wanted to ask y'all to talk briefly about, give the listeners some homework, to talk about who they are relative to the tree, and where they see themselves during these seasons.
That does take vulnerability. So your homework, I would say, would be assess yourself. Write down, start with the good. Start with the good. Write down some things that you're proud of, that you've accomplished. What fruit have you already produced in your life? And assess yourself. How can I reproduce that? Can I reproduce that? Where did this come from? What's the motivation behind this? What's feeding into me? What are my inputs right now? What kind of shows am I watching? And how does that impact? What kind of music am I listening to? What shows am I watching? And how does that impact the kind of fruit that I'm producing in my life? And one of the ways that you can do that is by looking at the people that you're closest with and seeing, how do I see myself in them, right? Because trees reproduce asexually, meaning they don't have intercourse, with other trees. They reproduce. A tree is a clone of itself, right? And so when you see yourself in somebody else, what is it that you see? Because that's the way that you can see yourself from another perspective, is by looking how other people reflect you to you, right? And then be vulnerable with that and be honest with yourself. And if you're not seeing the results that you want, you have to be willing to make that adjustment.
Wow. Simply put, be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Take the scripture.
Another great quote.
A platinum concept that if you desire to become a platinum hitter and live a platinum life, you must adapt the platinum way. Therefore, your mind must change in terms of who you are and how you see yourself. And that perspective must then become consistent with the actions that you take. And so the challenge is to identify what ways in which you need to change the way you think about the life you live and what adjustments need to be made so that you can begin to navigate in a new direction. Because one of the things that's so fundamental about the desire of a platinum hitter is that they want to be the best at what they are and at what they are becoming, even if they already know that they're not there yet. But they know that if they apply these principles, they're going to get there. So our encouragement for you to step into that platinum lifestyle and have that platinum mindset, begin to think differently about who you've been so that you can begin to develop the framework for who you will become.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Platinum Hitter Podcast. For more episodes, stay connected. Be sure to find us on all major social media platforms. We go by Platinum Hitters. Also, you can join our email list by texting PH to 31996. Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you're new. And until next time,